How would you react if the man sitting next to you in first class was Tom Brady, and you didn't even realize it? For most people, meeting the greatest quarterback of all time would be an unforgettable moment. But for one man on a flight from Boston to Los Angeles, it was a missed opportunity and a painful lesson in humility. This isn't a story about football. It's about how we treat people when we think they're nobody, and how quickly everything can change when we find out who they really are. Tom Brady has spent decades under the spotlight. 7 Super Bowl wins, countless records, a legacy etched into NFL history. But even now, off the field, away from the cameras, he still gets judged by people who don't see him, who see only what they want to see. This story begins in a luxury airport lounge and ends with a moment of silence so powerful it left the entire cabin stunned. And the man who made the insult? Let's just say he won't forget that flight. So stay with us until the end, because what you're about to hear may change how you see Tom Brady forever. And more importantly, it may make you think twice before judging anyone, ever again. It started like any other early morning at Logan International Airport in Boston. The first-class lounge was quiet, filled with business travelers sipping coffee and scrolling through emails. Among them sat Tom Brady, cap low, hoodie pulled up, blending in as best he could. He wasn't there to be noticed. After years in the spotlight, Tom had mastered the art of going unnoticed. And besides, this wasn't game day. It was just a flight to Los Angeles for a youth foundation event he was supporting. Enter Mark. Mid-50s, finance background, Boston native, well-dressed, and loud enough for everyone in the lounge to hear. He was the kind of man who treated first class like a trophy, a symbol of having made it. Mark glanced over at Brady, not recognizing him. To him, Tom looked like any other millennial, casual, unshaven, nose in a book. He scoffed to himself and made a passing comment to the lounge attendant. Funny who they let into first class these days. Tom heard it, so did the staff, but he said nothing. Mark kept going, loud enough to make it uncomfortable. These kids with their hoodies think they're royalty. Bet he's some washed-up YouTuber. The irony hung in the air like static. Tom didn't flinch. He simply turned a page in his book, one about mindfulness and quiet leadership. The attendant smiled nervously and said, "That's Mr. Brady, sir." Mark paused, blinked. Tom Brady? The name hit like a slap. There was a moment of disbelief, then a flush of red creeping up Mark's neck. But Tom didn't look up. He just kept reading, as if none of it mattered. But it did, to everyone watching, especially Mark. It was the beginning of a lesson he wasn't expecting. At 35,000 feet. Boarding was called shortly after the awkward lounge exchange. Mark tried to stay behind, clearly rattled. Maybe he was hoping to avoid facing Brady again, but fate had other plans. As passengers began filing into the first-class cabin, Mark's heart sank when he saw where he'd been seated. 2A, window seat, and 2B, already occupied by none other than Tom Brady. There he was, settled in, headphones on, still avoiding eye contact. The moment wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was silent, and that silence said more than words ever could. Mark took his seat reluctantly, clearly trying to figure out what to say. He was a Boston guy, born and raised. He should have known. He'd cheered for Brady for years without ever truly seeing him. He cleared his throat. "Hey, listen, I didn't realize it was you back there." Brady looked over briefly and nodded politely. "No worries." Then he went back to his headphones. But Mark couldn't leave it alone. His pride wrestled with his guilt. "I've followed your whole career, man. I thought you were some kid with TikTok or something." Brady gave a half smile, but didn't engage. Mark wasn't used to being ignored. He was used to commanding attention, respect, especially in places like this. And yet, here he was, sitting next to someone who had achieved more than he could ever dream of, and he'd insulted him before takeoff. The plane taxied down the runway. Mark glanced at Brady again, unsure if he should apologize properly or just leave it alone. But something about Brady's composure made him pause. It wasn't passive, it was powerful. This wasn't about status. It was about presence. Brady didn't need to say anything. He let his silence speak for him. And that silence was saying, "You already told me who you are. Now I'm showing you who I am." As the engines roared and the flight lifted off, Mark realized something that made his chest tighten. The real difference between them wasn't about seats, money, or fame. It was about character. About an hour into the flight, the captain announced a patch of turbulence ahead. Seatbelts clicked. The cabin dimmed. And in that brief moment of vulnerability, something shifted in the air. Mark sat stiffly, pretending to read a business magazine. Tom, meanwhile, calmly sipped water and looked out the window, completely unfazed. His presence was steady, almost grounding. He wasn't performing. He wasn't proving. He was simply being. It was unsettling for Mark. He glanced over again. "I've always wondered," he said suddenly, voice low. "How do you stay so calm? Under pressure?" Brady finally turned, studying Mark for a second. "Because pressure isn't the enemy," Tom said. "It's the privilege. You only feel it when something matters." Mark blinked. That wasn't the answer he expected. Tom continued. "The hard part isn't the Super Bowl. It's staying grounded when the cameras are gone, when you're just a guy sitting in 2B. The words landed hard. Mark nodded slowly. "Guess I didn't expect you to be sitting here like this." "Why not?" Brady asked. Mark hesitated, then shrugged. "Because you're, Tom Brady." Brady smiled, not arrogantly, but knowingly. "And that means I can't be human?" That stopped Mark cold. He realized in that moment that he'd built people like Tom into something untouchable, either idolized or dismissed. He had never imagined a version of Brady who read quietly, flew alone, and answered with calm instead of ego. But now, faced with the reality, Mark felt something he hadn't expected to feel: shame. Not because he hadn't recognized Tom, but because he hadn't respected him, not as a celebrity, but as a man. As the flight cruised westward, the cabin lights dimmed, and most passengers settled into silence. But Mark couldn't rest. Brady's calm demeanor, his words, they stirred something deep in him. Mark had spent years chasing status, promotions, luxury, the image of success. He'd always assumed that's what people like Tom Brady valued too. But now he was seeing something different, something quieter, something more powerful. He broke the silence again. "Must be exhausting, being recognized everywhere." Brady looked over and nodded. "Sometimes, but that's not what wears you out." Mark waited. "It's the assumptions," Brady said. "People think they know you, that you've had it easy, that your life is perfect, but they don't see the hours, the losses, the sacrifices." Mark was silent. Tom leaned back in his seat. "I've missed birthdays, funerals, years I'll never get back with my family. People see the rings. They don't see the price." It was quiet again. Mark thought of his own life, of the late nights, the missed moments, the things he traded for a seat in first class. Maybe they weren't so different after all. And maybe, just maybe, the man he'd mocked for not looking the part had lived with more integrity than most people ever would. The cabin lights brightened as the plane began its descent. Passengers stirred, adjusting their seats, preparing for landing. But Mark stayed still, quietly staring at the tray table in front of him. For the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar: humility. He turned toward Tom and spoke, this time with no performance, no pride. "I was out of line," he said. "In the lounge. I judged you without even thinking. And I'm sorry." Brady looked at him. Really looked at him. There was no sarcasm, no smugness. Just that same steady calm. "It happens," Tom said. "We all make assumptions." Mark nodded. "But I should have known better. I've watched you my whole life. You weren't just about football. You were about how to carry yourself." Brady smiled faintly. "Then maybe this was a reminder." Mark exhaled, as if something he'd been carrying had just been lifted. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd held on to the idea that success meant being better than others, louder, faster, richer. But here was Tom Brady, a man who had reached the pinnacle of greatness, showing him that quiet strength was the real power. The plane touched down with a gentle thud. As the jet rolled toward the gate, Tom reached into his backpack and handed Mark something small, a worn leather wristband. On it, a single word was etched. Still. It was given to me years ago, Brady said. Helped me stay centered when everything around me was chaos. Maybe now it's your turn. Mark stared at it, eyes watering. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't expensive. But it was the most valuable thing he'd received in years, not because of what it was, but because of who it came from. A week later, Mark sat alone in his home office, staring at the leather wristband on his desk. He hadn't taken it off since the flight. Every time he looked at it, he remembered more than the embarrassment. He remembered the lesson. Mark had spent a lifetime building an image, but in just a few hours beside Tom Brady, that image had cracked, and something real had started to grow in its place. He began to think differently. At meetings, he listened more. At home, he put his phone down. And at his firm, he initiated a new mentorship program, not to build his brand, but to lift others up. One afternoon, a young intern nervously asked him, "What changed you?" Mark smiled, touched the bracelet on his wrist, and simply said, "A man in 2B. He never told the full story. He didn't need to. Because the point wasn't about who Tom Brady was. It was about how he chose to live, with grace, with humility, with a strength so quiet, it made the loudest people in the room look small. Mark finally understood what real greatness looked like, not the kind that wins games, the kind that wins hearts. Years later, whenever Mark flew first class, he'd glance at the seat beside him, 2B, and remember. Not the embarrassment, but the lesson. He remembered how Tom Brady didn't need to raise his voice, defend his legacy, or call attention to himself. He simply sat there, fully present, fully himself, and in doing so taught more in silence than most teach in speeches. Mark's life never went viral, but it became more meaningful, more intentional, and all because one man, judged for his hoodie, chose compassion over confrontation. To Mark, Tom Brady would always be more than a quarterback. He was the stranger in 2B, who redefined what it meant to be great. We often think greatness is loud, that it's measured in trophies, headlines, and roaring crowds. But sometimes it reveals itself in the quietest moments, like a man in a hoodie, reading a book in first class, silently teaching the world what true character looks like. Tom Brady could have put that man in his place. He could have made a scene, demanded respect, reminded everyone of his status. But he didn't. Instead, he let his presence speak. He let dignity speak. And in doing so, he changed a man's life. Not with a football, but with a simple choice to remain still, strong, and human. This story isn't about a flight. It's about what happens when humility meets arrogance, and humility wins. So the next time you feel tempted to judge someone by what they wear, how they look, or how quietly they carry themselves, remember the man in 2B. What do you think was Tom Brady's most defining moment? Was it a game-winning pass? Or the day he said nothing at all? Let us know in the comments. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. And stay tuned. In our next video, we'll share another powerful story about how resilience can change everything.